So I should begin with a confession, which is that the Invisible Institute started as a joke. I worked for a number of years in high-rise public housing on the south side of Chicago in the last decade before demolition. And we had what we thought of as a human rights documentation project. We created a web publication, The View from the Ground. And when we started publishing The View as a kind of thumb my nose at academia and think tanks, I said it was published under the auspices of something called the Invisible Institute. It was a crack. And the name has followed me around ever since. You know, it came to be associated with a certain set of themes, a style of approach, a set of collaborative relationships. And now, all these years later, we actually are an institute, or better described as a production company. We're incorporated, we're funded, major media refer to us and cite us with a straight face. So the joke's on me. I mean, it sort of came around. But in ways that I can push off from Kurt's presentation, in ways that weren't anticipated when I made the wisecrack, the name is actually appropriate. It's apt, because at the center of our work is the proposition that great stories, necessary stories, are in plain sight, but we don't see them. And the reason we don't see them is the power of the gravitational field of official narratives. And that power is aided and abetted in all sorts of ways by our human genius for denial, for knowing things and not knowing them at the same time. So we've come to understand our work very much as a matter of telling compelling stories, but also investigating, reporting on, describing the machinery by which the official narrative takes hold. And it has turned out that part of the story is at the absolute center of our discourse about police accountability. For me, as I said, this process and journey started immersed in an abandoned community on the south side of Chicago, starting in the mid-90s till all the buildings had been demolished by 2006, 2007. And my work came to focus on what I thought of then and think of now as sort of attacking the disconnect between the sort of policy discourse about overhauling public housing, about police, about community violence, but the sort of policy discourse that takes place in a kind of mid-level area of abstraction and observable reality on the ground. Just a radical disconnect between what could be observed, what could be tested on your nerve endings, and this kind of hermetically sealed policy conversation. It was in the context of that work over a number of years that I started reporting on police issues of police misconduct and abuse and impunity, because I observed it every day. And it took a while to see it, and then when I saw it, I couldn't not see it. And it extended from just incivilities at one extreme to the other end of the spectrum, really egregious human rights abuses, including torture and murder. So I wrote for a number of years about what I was witnessing on the ground, and I thought of it as human rights reporting in the sense that the touchstone, the focus, was not so much on policy, but on injuries to particular individuals. And I think it's with my colleagues and collaborators, it's sort of our touchstone to keep coming back to as we go forward now with an extraordinary public discourse about reforming police departments. A lot of the language we use, accountability, impunity, transparency, these are quite abstract words. They're useful. They're really useful. I'm not minimizing their usefulness, but it's important to remember and always come back to bedrock and to the reality that these structural injustices and inequalities are on a daily basis enforced by particular blows from particular hands against particular bodies. And that was really the nature of the reporting and the engagement in those years. But a question formed out of that, which is, this was a reality that, my colleagues and I came to know. This was a matter of years of work. The question formed, what set of institutional relationships, how would the world have to be organized for what we're observing from day to day in this shipwrecked and abandoned community to be the reality? And that set in motion another kind of storytelling, another kind of inquiry, one that involved a lot of collaboration with lawyers, because close to 10 years of litigation in both federal and state court in trying to extract from behind a wall of secrecy a body of information about the practices of the police department in the city in terms of investigating allegations of abuse, citizens' complaints. And that process, which we can talk more about later or on the side, culminated in 2014 in a major freedom of information precedent. And I'm actually a guy who doesn't like titles. I'm a writer, and when people describe me as founder of the Invisible Institute, director of the Invisible Institute, it makes me sort of uncomfortable, but I really liked the name of this lawsuit. I was the plaintiff, and it's Kalven versus Chicago. So I can live with that. And it establishes as a matter of principle that police misconduct files, the investigative files of citizen complaints of police abuse, belong to the public. This is public information. It belongs to us. So, another kind of inflection point in my journey and the process of the Invisible Institute is we had this unexpected, really robust, unqualified legal decision which established a principle of transparency, but that principle is not self-executing. It's kind of like saying we're free because we have the First Amendment. Well, we're free if we exercise the First Amendment, but, and similarly here. So one of the roles that we took on at the Invisible Institute, staffed up for the purpose, is engaging with the question of how to operationalize transparency, how to make this information legible, useful, interesting to the broadest possible public. And so we have created something. I urge you to take a look at it and let me know what you think. The Citizens Police Data Project, which is the largest sort of interactive database of its kind, and allows for another kind of storytelling based on aggregate statistics. I would also emphasize in this context where we're talking about storytelling that our battle with official secrecy in Chicago can also be seen as a matter of liberating other people's stories. We now have access, and the public has access, to tens of thousands, soon to hundreds of thousands, of citizen complaints. We talk about data, but these are actually stories of individual citizens who, against all odds, given the almost infinitesimally small sustained rate for complaints, against all odds, came to the state seeking redress for what they thought was abuse by the police. So this incredible archive of stories now belongs to the public. It's against that background and in that context that I first heard the name Laquan McDonald. And it came from a whistleblower who knew of our work and contacted one of my lawyers within a week, I believe, 10 days maybe, of the incident in October 20th, 2014, with the news that what had been reported in the press was widely at variance with the facts of the case. This was somebody in law enforcement who, to this day, hasn't been named, the whistleblower. And he told us this is horrific. There's video. He had some information that ultimately allowed me to track down a civilian witness to the shooting. And he indicated, I have no confidence that the agency charged with investigating police shootings in Chicago is going is going to make a vigorous, serious investigation. It's extraordinary for me to be here with you and in front of other audiences. I'm sure Kurt must feel like this about the Flint water situation, because I think back to maybe within 2 or 3 weeks of the incident when I first went and stood at the beginning of a reporting journey on this case at 41st and Pulaski on the southwest side of Chicago, where the young man was killed, and wondered what happened here, just trying to get my mind around it. And to sort of follow the kind of narrative arc from that moment to now, when the story of Laquan McDonald, at least in Chicago, and I think to some degree nationally, really bears comparison as a public narrative with the story of Emmett Till, as a particular story, a particular narrative that sort of broke through into people's moral imaginations and allowed access to perceptions of these larger structural realities sort of built into the structural violence built into the society we've created. And it's important to note, and I think it sometimes gets lost sight of, in the media and the press, we like to describe everything as a crisis. Well, a crisis is a departure from the norm. And what we're contending with nationally, what we're contending with, hugely in Chicago, is actually not a departure from the norm. It is the norm. It's the kind of society we've created. And I think there are particular challenges in terms of storytelling in that vein. And I think there are huge political challenges in terms of maximizing the opportunity we now have for really fundamental change. And when I say what we're contending with is the norm, I don't want to suggest that the execution of a child on the streets of Chicago is a normative event. These things and kindred things happen too often, but they're still exceptional atrocities. Everything that happened from the moment the boy was bleeding out on the ground is the norm. And we have this term that's widely used in talking about police abuse and police impunity, the code of silence. And it's one of those really powerful, resonant terms that does capture some part of the reality, but it eclipses and obscures some other aspects. Yes, there is a code of silence. Officers, for fear of reprisal, if they break ranks, if they report on misconduct by fellow officers, really do, there is a kind of coerced silence. They face ferocious retaliation if they break ranks. And there's another pool of silence of people in the neighborhoods most affected who feel like it's unavailing to complain, knowing that the police will just sort of line up shoulder to shoulder and deny anything happened. What's not captured, and what I think relates to the themes and focus of this convening, is it's really fundamentally not a phenomena of silence. It's a narrative phenomena. It's a matter of narrative control. And the Laquan McDonald case illustrates this stunningly. So the city and the police department, within hours of the incident, and we can document this now, knew everything we know now about what happened on October 20th. They had multiple police and civilian witnesses. They had the video and they knew they had it. The autopsy was performed at 8, Laquan was declared dead at 10:45 at night. The autopsy was begun at 8:30 the next morning. Autopsies take a while to be finalized. It doesn't take long to determine that there were 16 independent gunshot wounds. The police department in the city had all of that information at the time they put out a press release that said, in effect, aggressive, erratic young man with a knife lunges at police officers. Police officer shoots him in the chest in self-defense and defense of his fellows. The boy dies sometime later at a nearby hospital. The press release basically said Laquan McDonald caused his own death. That was the subtext, very carefully constructed to that end. That was the narrative, knowing that it was false, with the means to know that it was false, that the city put out. And that narrative then requires, in order to sustain it, the things that happen almost immediately. And without coordination, everybody knew their roles. There's sort of an a priori set of expectations. It involved the intimidation of witnesses, destruction of evidence, falsification of reports. Ultimately, further downstream, the $5 million settlement with Laquan McDonald's family in the hope of containing the now famous video from coming out. So you had this situation where the city brought all, and the stonewalling of the press and withholding of public information from the public for however many months it was, over a year. So you have this incredible effort of narrative control. And this has actually become a central part of our work at the Invisible Institute. And I would urge on you as a sort of a subject matter generally, not just deploring the official narrative or seeing ourselves as, Stas Terkel used to describe my work as guerrilla journalism, which I always kind of liked. It's not just a guerrilla foray. We need to describe that machinery, whether it's in Flint or in Chicago or elsewhere, in order to disable it. We need to better understand it. To end on a really positive note, and I'm sure if you follow events in Chicago, you know this, but putting it in the terms of this conference, the extraordinary thing that has happened as a consequence of the Laquan McDonald, there have been all sorts of things you can point to, police superintendents fired, special commissions constituted, district attorneys voted out of office, state's attorneys voted out of office. But the single most extraordinary circumstance that defines the political life of Chicago right now and really supports and reinforces the trajectory of this gathering is the city has lost control of the narrative. The city has utterly lost control of the narrative, and that has created an occasion that I think requires all of us, not just journalists, but all sorts of other players in this drama to elevate our game to be worthy of this moment so that this historic opening for really fundamental and enduring change is fully realized. Thank you very much.